of predestination. And again, what predestination refers to is a collection of ideas, a collection of beliefs, where that begins with the idea that before each and every person in the world is born, God has predestined every individual to go to heaven or hell. So in other words, whether or not any person ends up in heaven or hell had already been established before that person was even born. Okay? And then, once born, there was nothing a person could do, ever, at any point in their entire life, that could alter or change their predestined path. In other words, if you're born predestined to go to hell, then there's nothing in the world that you could ever do during your entire life to change that fundamental fact. And likewise, if you're born predestined to go to heaven, then there's nothing that you could do or that could happen that would alter or change your predestined path to heaven. Okay? Now, what was characterized by Calvin as the great mystery is that you could never know. It was absolutely impossible for you to know what your predestined path was. You would never know what your predestined path was until the day you died, Judgment Day. And on Judgment Day, it would finally be revealed to you whether you were predestined to go to heaven or predestined to go to hell. Now, this is an idea that is strange to many. And they think it's odd that as they seem to understand what predestination is all about, that some guy could be predestined to go to heaven and be a serial killer and still go to heaven. That's not what Calvin said. Because again, nobody, not the person themselves or anyone else, would know what a person's predestined path was. So if someone is a serial killer, but yet they still think that they're predestined to go to heaven, doesn't mean they are. Just because someone thinks that they're on a particular predestined path doesn't mean that they are. And that includes those who think they're predestined to go to heaven, as well as those who think that they're predestined to go to hell. No one knows. Only God. And God will not reveal that your predestined path to you until you die. Now, this is the purpose behind behind Calvin's development of this idea. The reasons were very real and legitimate. What was a prevalent view among many Christians, Protestants and Catholics alike, is that you could do good works, that you could do nice things, and as a result of doing nice things, you earn points that move you closer to heaven. And from Calvin's perspective, that whole belief was corrupt. The idea that people are doing good things so that they can benefit themselves. That's a problem. In other words, what Calvin is asserting is that if you believe that if you are doing something good to benefit yourself, then you're doing it for the wrong reason. which is corrupt. And so what Calvin was trying to do was take the whole question of heaven and hell off the table by saying, nobody knows. Nobody knows. So don't worry about it. Don't think about it. There's no reason. There's no point in thinking about it. The decision's already made. And there's nothing you can do to change it. Now, another element of this is that, as Calvin lays it out, the majority of us, according to Calvin, are predestined to go to hell. That only a select few are predestined to go to heaven. And so, again, what's at the core of predestination is to create the mindset, to create the mentality for us to do the right thing, simply because it's the right thing to do. And for those who believed in this, who accepted this idea, and they were a small element of the Protestant, a small minority of the Protestant community, okay? But for those who accepted this idea of predestination, the idea then is that if you believe that odds are you're predestined to go to hell, and again, just because you think that doesn't mean you are. But that's what you think. And yet you can still do the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do. That you still do the right thing without any expectation of something in return. That shows a certain strength of character. Which then may mean that you may be one of the select. But who knows? And so this is what predestination is all about. Now, over time, I mean, it's hard for someone who is devoutly religious to simply dismiss all thought of whether or not they're going to heaven or going to hell. So what will become a characteristic of Calvinism, including the Puritans, is they will begin to accept the idea that if you are successful at whatever you've chosen to be, you could be a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker. It doesn't matter what you are. But if you are successful at whatever you have chosen to be, and if you are serving your community/country, and if you are behaving virtuously, then maybe you might be one of the select. Still no guarantee. But this was something that you could at least hang your hat on. These were things that were tangible. Okay? And then being successful. That's something you know. You know when you're successful. Just as you know when you're not. You know if you're serving your community. You know if you're serving your country. And again, the tough one though is the behaving virtuously one. That's the tricky one. But here's the thing. You know when you're successful, but so do other people. You know if you're serving your community, if you're serving your country, but so do other people. But behaving virtuously, only you know. Only you truly know if you are behaving virtuously. And so let me give you an example. Because again, another key aspect of predestination is not only does it not matter what you think, because you can't know what your predestined path is, it doesn't matter what other people think about you, because they can't know either. But yet, here's what may be a situation. Let's say someone has chosen to be a butcher, and they are among the most successful people in the community. They are wealthy, they live comfortably, more so than most other people. It's obvious that they're serving their country, serving their community. They give to charity, they volunteer for public service, and they do all these things that, again, are crucial for the success of the community. But then, every time they sold a pound of meat, they were putting their thumb on the scale. That meant every time they sold meat, they were cheating their customers. Were they behaving virtuously? No. Now, their customers may never know this. Their customers may never have a clue. And their customers, who are also other Calvinists, they might think, that guy's got to be one of the select. But again, if he wasn't behaving virtuously, then no, he's not. And again, no one else knew he wasn't behaving virtuously, but he knew. He knew that he was cheating his customers. And, as Calvin would say, so does God. And so the idea then is that the reason a person could not change their predestined path is because God, from the Calvinist perspective, knew exactly how everything would play out. And so, again, we don't. So this is the idea behind predestination. And it's going to be this set of ideas where Calvinists in particular begin to look for signs, look for indications, look for hints that are tangible, that might give them some little degree of assurance that they might be, maybe, one of the select. Because when you go back over the course of 1,000 years of history, prior to the Protestant Reformation, prior to the existence of John Calvin, there was no such thing as upward social mobility. If you were born poor, you would die poor. Your children would be born poor, and they would die poor. The laws and the social structure of European culture and European society is that your place within that society, whether you're at the very bottom or at the top, was strictly based on birth. So if you were born to parents who are poor, you would die poor. You would live out your entire life as a poor person. And there, again, was no way for you to change your social status. And again, by the same token, there is no such thing as downward social mobility. If you were born rich, you would die rich. And so, again, your position, your place within the European social structure was strictly determined based on your birth. And again, nothing could change that. But what begins to happen, again, as a consequence of the Protestant Reformation and the emergence of Calvinism in particular, is you suddenly have in areas where Calvinism becomes prevalent, people realizing, hey, I was born poor. Which still, in this period of the 1500s, meant odds are you're going to die poor. Which then means you're not going to be successful. And if you're not successful, that makes it much more difficult to do things to serve your community, to serve your country. And again, it had to be all three. So, I mean, if you were behaving virtuously, but still not successful, if you were behaving virtuously, but unable to serve your community or serve your country, the fact that you're behaving virtuously didn't matter. Just like if you were successful, but not behaving virtuously. It had to be all three. And so what this will do is it will create a mindset among Calvinists in particular, where they will begin to look for opportunities to make themselves become successful. And again, they will then begin to seek out ways to serve their community as they become more successful. And then, if they can manage to behave virtuously, then maybe they might be one of the select. And so when it came to those Calvinists, then their core religious views were encased within their desire for economic success. But again, if they achieve that economic success by cheating, then they're not behaving virtuously. If they achieved that economic success by committing crime, they are not behaving virtuously. Okay? So the idea then is that they focus on ways to be successful, to serve their country, to serve their community in ways that also allow them to behave virtuously. And so it's going to be this combination of ideas, this convergence of ideas, that will again be where people are looking for opportunities to become more successful. And what will allow for much more opportunities is going to be the massive influx of gold from Central America, gold and silver from Central and South America. This is going to create a lot more opportunity for people to become more successful. And so when the Puritans, when the small group of English Calvinists then decide that they're going to leave and go to North America, They're not leaving because they're being persecuted. They're not leaving England to seek freedom of religion. If they were seeking freedom of religion, England was the place to be. England was already the most religiously tolerant country in Europe. And again, English Calvinists were not being persecuted. The reason they chose to leave is because they also believed that they were God's chosen people, which from the Calvinist perspective, that meant that they were to set the example for others to follow. Now, those English Calvinists, as I mentioned earlier, the Puritans, I'm going to just start referring to them as Puritans. The English Puritans, they emerged as a group in the mid-1500s. And they believe that it was their responsibility, it was their purpose, their mission from God to change England from within, to set the example for others to follow, where they would then be successful, that they would be serving their country, serving their community, and behaving virtuously, and that people would see that and admire that, respect that, and want to be like them. So again, it's against the Puritan idea to force people to think the way they think. What they were wanting to do was to make themselves successful so that they could then allow themselves to serve their community, serve their country, while at the same time behave virtuously, so that others would want to imitate them. And as more people imitate them, then England begins to change from within. Okay? Now, by the early 1600s, the 16 teens, there are elements within the Puritan community who are beginning to get frustrated. That for decades now, they've been setting the example, but no one seems to be paying attention. And so some Puritans begin to decide that England is too corrupt. That because England is so corrupt, no one can even see. In other words, the success that the Calvinists are experiencing is obscured by all of the corruption. And if people in England cannot fully see how successful they are, then how can they imitate them? How can they want to be like a group of people they don't really even see? So some Puritans, they simply decided to abandon the whole project, to just leave England and focus on themselves. And these Puritans who just want to abandon the effort and just focus on themselves will be known as separatists. And these are the ones who are more popularly known as the Pilgrims, who left England on the Mayflower and established the Plymouth colony in 1620. So again, let me just go back and open up a couple of these earlier handouts that help. So again, when the colonies are being established, Jamestown, Virginia, was the first colony established in 1607. And then the Plymouth colonies established by the Puritan separatists in 1620. Now, 10 years later, by 1630, there will be another group of English Puritans who will decide, who will reach the same conclusion as the separatists, that England is too corrupt, so that, in other words, they are bound to fail in the mission that God has sent them on, because England is too corrupt, and because of that corruption, no one is paying attention. And again, the idea is that if you genuinely believe that you are on a mission from God and you fail, then that's not what you just think of as a personal failure, that you failed God. And so for someone who genuinely believes this kind of idea, then failure is not an option. And so by the late 1620s, there's another group of Puritans, and we're just going to call them Puritans, who were prepared to leave. They weren't abandoning the mission. What they wanted to do was leave England, go to North America, which they believed was a pristine, uncorrupted environment, where then they could achieve their success in a way that is unfiltered, that everyone would be able to observe and see. And once they were able to observe and see how they were successful, how they were serving their country, and how they were behaving virtuously, then people would go, wow, look at them. That's how I should be. That's how I want to be. And the transformation begins. So again, the Puritans that I'm talking about who left started leaving in the late 1620s and 1630, they weren't abandoning the mission like the separatists were. They were simply going somewhere else where they could continue the mission. So they will then establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Okay? Which, again, is what we see here. Now, still, the majority of the Puritan community chose to stay because they were still committed to the idea that their mission was to change England from within. So in other words, leaving was not an option. And so What happens then is when you look at these events we talked about in Unit 1, the Civil War that occurred in the 1640s, that Civil War is sometimes referred to as the Puritan Revolution. What you had, because of this belief about being, and this focus on being successful, and this focus on serving their community and serving their country, by the 1620s, 1630s, those who were among the wealthiest people in England were Puritan. And it's going to be the tension between the Puritans, who were among the most influential members of Parliament. Oliver Cromwell was one of the Puritan leaders. And so the idea then is that when King Charles started dismissing Parliament, then that cut off the primary avenue for Puritans in England to serve their country and serve their community. So again, they were successful. And again, if they were behaving virtuously, that didn't matter if they couldn't serve their community or serve their country. And so this will help shape and fuel the mindset that will lead to this Civil War. The things that King Charles I did against Parliament, which had, again, was powerfully influenced by the Puritans, simply was not acceptable. And it triggers the English Civil War, also known as the Puritan Revolution. And the Puritans win. And what do? We talked about the Navigation Acts, which actually made it easier for more people who weren't Puritans to become more successful. And another key element of this is for people who are wealthy, people who become more successful, as these joint stock companies begin to represent the interests of England, then by simply buying stock in these companies becomes another way for you to serve your country, to serve your community. And again, this was not a mindset among the Puritans that you had to be a Puritan to play in this process, to play a role in this process. It wasn't about a denomination. It was about a way of life. And so again, the Puritans get a bad rap. And a lot of that is influenced by tragic events that occur later, like the Salem witchcraft trials. And there's this idea that they were repressive, they were hateful people, and that's simply not the case. Okay? Again, the Puritans get a bad rap. The reality is they were very tolerant. And they were tolerant in ways that even make us look kind of timid. One of the things that the Puritans were, and again, not only Puritans, again, Calvinists, and there were Calvinists all over, okay? One of the things that they were pretty tolerant of were different views toward sex. Yeah. So again, what was characteristic and what still may be characteristic among many people who are Catholic, and I do not want to generalize. The Catholics are very diverse in their opinions and their outlooks on life. But again, even today, the Catholic Church has a strict prohibition on contraceptives. You, from the perspective of the leadership of the Catholic Church, you are not to utilize birth control. That is considered a sin. Certain sexual acts are not to be allowed, not to be tolerated. And this, again, created a kind of tension because some of these sexual acts were from the perspective of men, and I'm trying to keep this as tame as I possibly can. Okay? So bear with me. A lot of these prohibited sexual acts were highly sought after by men. So the idea that will set itself into their minds is they can't do that with their wives. But if they do it with somebody else. And how do you think that works for the marriage? No, it doesn't. And so what will become a characteristic among the Calvinist way of thinking is that as long as it occurs within a marriage and as long as it's consensual, anything goes. Nothing is prohibited as long as it occurs within the marriage and it is consensual, meaning both individuals within the marriage agree. And when you think about it, that is a much healthier perspective. That actually creates a stronger marriage. One of the leaders of, for example, of the Puritans who left and established Massachusetts Bay was a guy named John Winthrop. And so what John Winthrop, one of the things that we've learned of his life is that he had several friends who enjoyed hunting. And one day they convinced him to go along. And so he got a hunting rifle. He went out with his friends and they went hunting. And what he found was that it was cold. They were hunting geese and he was down in the marsh. And he got wet. So he's cold and wet. He didn't have any luck shooting any geese. So it was just kind of a bust for him. So even though his friends enjoyed it, he was miserable. So he just decided it wasn't for him. It wasn't for him. He would have never even imagined saying something like, because he didn't like to hunt, no one else should be allowed to hunt. And if you think about that logic I just laid out, you can apply it to a lot of controversies that are raging all around us today, where people who say, well, I don't like this. I don't agree with this. And because I don't agree, no one can do it. No one can do it. That's not a Puritan way of thinking. And so what we also know about John Winthrop is that he loved to drink. And he loved his wife. Oh my God, he loved his wife. And so from that Puritan mindset, if somebody became an alcoholic, which meant they could not handle their alcohol, then someone like John Winthrop would counsel that person to stop drinking, because clearly they can't handle it. But Winthrop would completely reject the idea that because somebody else couldn't handle their alcohol, that he should stop drinking, unless he reached a point in his life where he had become alcoholic. Okay? And so again, this was a mindset where you focused on what you did. You focused on how you were being successful. You focused on the ways in which you were serving your community, in which you were serving your country, and the degree to which you were behaving virtuously. It was none of your concern if someone else was or wasn't successful. It was not your concern if someone else was or wasn't serving their country. It was not their concern whether or not someone else was behaving virtuously. It was only where they were focusing on if they were successful, if they were serving their country, if they were behaving virtuously. And you know, if we could all actually live like that, this would be a pretty cool place. And so, again, it's this kind of thinking that, again, from the Puritan perspective, if their success created opportunities for others, great. And so again, they weren't, that was up to those other individuals to find opportunities in their success. And again, if that then created opportunities for them to become more successful and serve their community, hey, then that makes the community stronger. That makes the country stronger. So this is the way religion was an influence in early American culture. And again, it's not just about religious doctrine. It's about structuring your life and living your life in a way that allows for you to be successful and serve your community, while at the same time behaving virtuously. And so, I hope this makes sense to you, because this is, again, what has gotten lost in the idea. Again, the people who were religiously oriented, like the Puritans, who came to settle in America, they weren't coming here to establish a rigid set of religious doctrine that everyone would be required to accept. Okay? Now, the Puritans are going to usher in another fundamental transformation. Again, let's be clear. When you look at the doctrine of predestination as a religious concept, it's really of little significance, because only a small percentage of the Protestant community ever acknowledged predestination in terms of a precept of their religious outlook. The significance of predestination is found in its economic impact, where you found people who were Calvinists who then were looking for opportunities to succeed, but then also found ways, as they were becoming more and more successful, found ways for other people to become successful as well. Now, so predestination's real significance is in terms of its economic impact and its impact on legal traditions. Again, when you go back to that 1,000 years or so before the Protestant Reformation, the prevailing legal traditions entailed the presumption of guilt, that if you were accused of a crime, the word of your accuser was taken above all, and you were presumed guilty, and that you would have to prove your innocence, which is an incredibly difficult standard to reach. It's extremely difficult to prove a negative, which then meant overwhelmingly, simply by the fact that you're accused, would virtually guarantee your conviction. And again, in this time period, we did not have anything like penitentiaries, where you could be sentenced to a period of time where you could then serve your sentence and then be released. And so there were two primary punishments: execution and mutilation. So execution meant they killed you. Now, mutilation, you would survive, and you could live for decades after. But you would have, and let me just clarify, the most common mutilation was being branded, where they would take a hot iron and burn a symbol into your skin. And again, that symbol, whatever it was, would be burned into your skin in a way that would be extremely difficult to hide, to conceal. So you would be released from prison after your mutilation, released from jail. But then, if you were branded a thief, overwhelmingly, anyone who met you for the first time would see that brand, and they would know you're a thief. And that would automatically shape the way they would react to you, the degree to which they would trust you. So again, if you were convicted, there were jails, of course. And so, but the jails were essentially holding pens. That you'd be held in jail until your trial. And if you were convicted, you would go back to jail, where depending on the crime you committed, you would be kept in jail until it was your turn to be executed, or it was your turn to be branded. So then you'd be taken out of jail and killed, or you'd be taken out of jail and branded and then let go. This was a very harsh and unforgiving kind of legal system. And it allowed for the possibility that a whole bunch of people who were innocent of the crime they were accused of committing to be executed or mutilated for, again, a crime they did not commit. So, from the Puritan perspective, serving within that judicial system, whether you're serving as a judge, serving as a prosecutor, serving as a defense attorney, serving as a member of the jury, if you were part of that, system. You are serving your community and serving your country in a way that is extremely vital. But if this system was allowing for innocent blood to be spilled, you were not behaving virtuously. But just removing yourself from that system, removing yourself from that process, again, was not acceptable either. So what's going to happen? And this comes from a Puritan perspective. Because of this idea of predestination, what's going to begin to emerge by the mid-1600s in England is this idea that if you are accused of a crime, you are presumed innocent. And it's your accuser who must prove that you're guilty. And not only that, but your accuser must prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So again, the way that it works is if you are the victim of crime, you report your crime to the law. And then if the law places that person who's been accused under arrest, then it's the prosecutor who becomes the accuser. So then the prosecutor presents the evidence to the jury. And it's then the prosecutor as the accuser who has to prove the guilt of the accused beyond a reasonable doubt. And the reason for that standard is because still, even after these changes, the two primary punishments were execution and mutilation. And neither one of those could be taken back. If a person is accused of a crime and convicted and then executed and then it's found out later that they didn't do it, well, they're still dead. If a person has been branded and then it's shown later that they did not commit the crime, well, they have still been branded. This is before plastic surgery. So it's not like they could just get rid of it. So the standard of reasonable doubt is not for the accused, it's for the jury. The things that occur within the law that emerge as a result of this, that are perceived to benefit the accused, and in some cases benefit the accused unfairly, it's not to benefit the accused, it's to benefit the jury. So that people who serve in that jury would be able to sleep and be assured that everything has been done to give that accused the opportunity to have, again, to be acquitted, to be found not guilty. So that if they are, then the members of the jury can rest assured that if that person has been executed, it's because they did it. If that person has been mutilated, it's because they did it. And so then, as individuals, they were behaving virtuously while serving their community. So that, again, becomes transformative. And English common law changes. And these precepts that then result in this new version of English common law become the foundation for American common law as a result of the English colonies in North America. And so again, don't think, again, that predestination is significant because of its religious element. The doctrine of predestination stands as one of the most significant concepts in Western culture because of its economic impact.